In 1965, there was a book written by Donald Gray Barnhouse, and it was called The Invisible War. In the battle, it's called the battle for the mind. It's a battle that is vicious, it's a battle that's intense, it's unrelenting because Satan never plays fair. And the reason why is he knows one thing, that your greatest asset is your mind. And we see that today in the world. We see that there are different ideas, different isms. Advertising is trying to conquer your mind. We don't need to look very far to see it. But I believe that the ultimate battle that is faced is the battle for truth. John 8:31-32, Jesus said to those Jews who believed in him, he said, "If you abide in my word, you are indeed my disciples. For you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." So I believe that the battle that we're fighting is a truth battle. And in particularly upon the authority of who Christ is and upon the authority of the Word of God. In John 14:6, what did Jesus say about himself? He said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh to the Father except through me." And John 17:17, what did Jesus say? He said, "Sanctify them by your truth. Your word is truth." And it's interesting today that when we look at this, that the battle is being fought to discredit the Word of God, and also to discredit Christ. Today there are many people that say that all roads lead to heaven. When you think about it, it doesn't make sense because all those roads are different. There are those who say that Jesus was one of many great religious teachers. As scholars have said, you can get all the religious teachers and you can put Christ, and there's a mile and a half difference. Now, there's that battle that's being fought. It's being fought in the mind, especially as a Christian. And we see that in our culture today. And in many ways, he's exceeded. There are today the churches that are falling away from those great biblical truths that they once held to. I believe in my own heart that we are seeing a time of great apostasy upon the Christian church today. Churches that held once to those traditions and those truths are now falling away. No truth is being undermined. Today we're told we don't talk about sin because it may offend people. We don't talk about hell because that may not bring people through the doors. We're told that if we want to be popular, we need to preach positive and good messages, because that's what people want to hear. They don't want to hear the truth of the Word of God. And it's so true. That's what we're seeing today. The church is joining in with the world upon a bandwagon in order to say, look, we will compromise, we'll water down truth, but we just want the world to come in to us. We want to be nice to the world. We don't want to offend anybody. That's the context in which Paul is writing into. If I can just go on and just take it a bit further, when we read the New Testament, it's interesting that there are many names that are mentioned. There are many lists. For example, if you go to Romans 16, there's a great big list of names that we may not be familiar with that Paul speaks about. In Colossians 3, there are names as well. Go to Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 3, we read about the genealogy of people, the names that we may not be familiar with, but if we did a study on them in the Old Testament, we'd probably get to know them. One of the things I like doing about Mother's Day and Father's Day is looking at people and trying to dig into their lives. I remember just before we went on holidays last year, I spoke about Aquila and Priscilla, and we looked at them and about how they were able to disciple a young man called Apollos. Names that aren't mentioned. But then we read people that we know a lot about. We read about a young man called Timothy. And in a month or so, we'll start looking at another young pastor called Titus. We read about the disciples, and probably the two people that we know the most about in the New Testament would be that of Jesus, of course, and the Apostle Paul. Paul is mentioned in Acts chapter 7:58. He was associated with the stoning of Stephen. And then we read about his conversion in Acts chapter 9. And then after this, we see that Paul went from being a man who was persecuting the church, to protecting the church, to being a preacher of the church, to be planting churches. His life had been radically changed. When we read about Paul, he wrote about a third of the New Testament. Some of those letters were written to individuals like Philemon and Titus and Timothy. The rest were written to churches that he planted. And we're blessed through those teachings. But one of the churches that he spent a lot of time with, and we read a lot about them. There's 2 letters addressed to this one church, and that was Corinth. If you know much about Corinth, if you're a pastor back 2,000 years ago and you were offered to go to the Corinth church, you probably would have been very diplomatic and said, no, the church at Philippi looks a lot more better than Corinth. Philippi was a good church, but Corinth had a lot of issues. There was disunity, there was sexual immorality, there's the abuse of the Lord's Supper, there was the abuse and the confusion of spiritual gifts. They were questioning about the resurrection, and Paul wrote to this church. After he left, as we read between the 1st and 2nd Corinthians, there are probably 2 other letters that were written, but they've been lost. And then we go into 2 Corinthians. If you go to 2 Corinthians, you look at chapters 1 to 9, Paul explains his ministry, and then about the collection to the saints at Macedonia. And then we come to chapters 10 to 13, and there's a very distinct change in Paul's voice. What had happened? Well, there's false teachers had come in, and they were starting to undermine who Paul was. So Paul starts to defend himself. And for Paul, there was a lot at stake. I think if Paul was here today, 2,000 years later, he'd still be very upset with what he sees within the church. The passage here is to help us see. And we see that in Paul's day that there are false teachers who are coming in there and undermining the teaching of the church. Today, nothing's changed. Today, we see a lot of groups coming in claiming to be Christian groups. They use the Christian terminology, they use Christian words, they speak Christian theology. But they say, oh, well, we don't believe this, we don't believe that. They say, we need to be progressive, we need to be a lot more in touch with society, we need to be a lot more relevant. Just downplay doctrine and just open up the doors for everybody, and don't be mean to them because you may offend them. You know, I think we need to take to heart what Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 5:21 when he says, test all things, hold fast to what is good. And in Titus chapter 1 verse 11, what Titus says is spot on. He said, whose mouths must be stopped, who subvert whole households, teaching things that they ought not for the sake of dishonest gain. It's almost like you wrote that yesterday. I was reading an example, I was looking at YouTube, and I'll just give one example. There was recently a TV evangelist came on and said this. They said, if you give $1,000 to my ministry, you will receive 7 supernatural blessings. What are the 7 supernatural blessings? Mark laughed, and so am I. They said this, God will assign angels to you. God will give you prosperity. God will take sickness from you. God will give you a year of blessing. God will bring you an increase of inheritance to you, and you will be an enemy to your enemies. Just send $1,000. Now I'm looking at you, and you're nodding your head. So am I. But you know what? There are people that fell for it. I was looking at another clip on YouTube, and it went for about 3 or 4 minutes, and it was of a secular group, and they got hold of this, and they were making a mockery. They were saying, who would want to send money to this? This person's a fraud. And I thought, you know, they're doing what the church should be doing, but the church doesn't want to do it because we may offend them. And yet this is being seen, and you see it everywhere. We could go for hours and talk about things like this, but this is just a small tip of the iceberg. You know, and Paul is saying, I think if Paul was here today, speaking to the church in the 21st century, he would be ballistic. Because we see it everywhere. You know, these groups, they need to be stopped. I'm sorry, they need to be stopped. And I was thinking about this, and I've had people say to me over the years, they know who I am, I'm a pastor, and they've said to me, oh, you're one of these guys who rips people, who gets people's money off them. And I said, no, I don't. And I said, look, what these people do is wrong. I said, I'm not like that. I'm not going to ask you for money. It's the last thing in the world. And even as I was thinking about this, I thought, people may be driving down Tony Road this morning, they see these television preachers and they say, I'm not going to go to the Church of Christ because they're just like these television guys. And so it affects us all. So these people need to be stopped. Don't buy this stuff. You know, and so that's the issue that Paul starts to address. It's very serious. It's a message that we need to take very much to heart. And I want to make just 2 observations. Look at verses 1 and 2, we look at Paul's compassion. In verses 1 and 2, Paul says this. He says, "Now I, Paul, myself, am pleading with you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, who in presence am lowly among you, and am being absent and bold toward you. But I beg you, that when I am present, that I may not be bold with that confidence by which I intend to be bold against some, who think of us as though we walk to the flesh." As you look at these verses, Paul is not coming across as a judge, but as a shepherd. Now, Paul sees the sheep at Corinth are being attacked by the wolves. It's not the first time he's spoken about this. In Acts 20:29, when he's speaking to the church at Ephesus, these are his last words. He says, "For I know after this, that after my departure, savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock." Jesus warned us in Matthew 7 about it. He said to be wary of those, of sheep in wolves' clothing. They look like shepherds, but they come in there and they devour a church. They tear a church to bits. And these teachers appeared to be Christians. But he's saying, but they weren't. And they were saying, well, Paul's just a paper tiger. He's saying all these bold words while he's away, but when he's with you, he's a paper tiger. And I think the best way to win anybody over when it comes to error is through gentleness and love. Especially in this context. Paul was a very meek man, but he could also be quite savage as well, because truth was at stake. You look at the life of Jesus. In Matthew 21, he drove away the money changers. Then in Matthew 23, you read about how he spoke to the religious leaders. He was scathing upon them. Why? Because they were leading people astray. They weren't sticking to what the Word of God says. Now, Paul was a man who loved the sheep. He loved the church. He loved the chief shepherd. In the book of John, chapter 10, verses 11, what did Jesus say? He said, "I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd gives his life for the sheep. But the hireling, he is one who is not the shepherd. One who does not own the sheep sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees. And the wolf catches the sheep and scatters them." This is probably a reference to the Old Testament, because it would have been terminology that the Jews would have been very familiar with. And even in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 2, speaking to the elders, and this goes to every congregation, he says this: "Shepherd the flock of God which is among you, serving as overseers, not by compulsion, but willingly, not for dishonest gain, but for eagerly." Let me say this: any true elder, any true pastor will protect the sheep. For example, if somebody says, "We've got this greatly gung-ho speaker coming into Werribee, he'll be here for 4 weeks and he wants to go to the church," and he rings us up and says, "I'd like to come to the Church of Christ in a couple of weeks and preach," what do? We don't open the door, do we? We check his website. We check him out. See, where are you coming from, mate? And if it's not biblical, we say, "Look, mate, we're not going to allow you to come in. We're going to do the diligence first." Why? Because we want to protect you as a flock from false teachers. That's our primary job. And so this is what Paul was. He was a man who loved the sheep, loved the shepherd, and wanted to protect them. And it should be for all of us. If you read a Christian book, or we listen to somebody preaching on YouTube, do it, but discern what they're preaching. Are they leading people to Christ, or are they leading people away from Christ? We have a responsibility, because what it takes is just a little bit of error. The false teacher doesn't come in with a placard. "Guess what? I'm a false teacher." You say, "Guess what, Joe? Bye-bye." But they're subtle. They come in. They may come up and say they read a King James Bible and they've got a suit, they look really good. Doesn't mean anything. We need to be discerned. This is what was happening at Corinth, and it's happening very much around the world today and in the evangelical church today. So what Paul says is very relevant to us, even though it's some 2,000 years ago. Then Paul goes on in verses 3 to 5 and speaks about the weapons, and I'll just read it. He says, "For though we walk in the flesh, we do not walk according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God for putting down strongholds, casting down arguments and every high thing that is exalted itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. It's interesting as we look at these three verses. Paul speaks at length about the spiritual battle. If you go to Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 to 20, Paul has spoken about it before, but here he speaks about it